By 1915, the Great War had reached a deadly stalemate. Desperate to break the deadlock, Allied leaders targeted the Dardanelles, hoping a naval strike against the Ottoman Empire would secure a quick victory. It was a plan born of ambition, but fueled by a total lack of understanding of the terrain. What was supposed to be a swift breakthrough soon spiraled into a nightmare of poor planning and heavy casualties. On April 25th, thousands of soldiers arrived at the rugged shores of Gallipoli. These men were heading into a trap of jagged cliffs and dug-in defenders. Instead of a strategic triumph, they found a brutal war of attrition that would last for months. This is the story of a campaign defined by incredible bravery and absolute failure. This is Gallipoli, the invasion that should never have happened. The tragedy of Gallipoli did not begin on the beaches, but in the grand offices of Whitehall in London. To understand why this invasion should never have happened, one must first understand the arrogance of the planners who believed that the mere sight of British warships would cause the Ottoman Empire to crumble. Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, was the primary architect of this gamble. He envisioned a naval operation where massive battleships would sail through the narrow Dardanelles Straits, bombard Constantinople, and force a surrender without a single soldier needing to set foot on land. It was a vision of clean, technical warfare that ignored the reality of modern coastal defenses. The British and French fleets were formidable, but they were sailing into a bottleneck protected by underwater minefields and hidden mobile artillery batteries. On March 18, 1915, the grand naval plan met its doom. 3 massive battleships were sunk by mines, and several others were badly damaged. Instead of admitting defeat, the Allied command decided that if the Navy could not force the straits alone, the Army would have to do it for them. This was the first and most fatal pivot point. The element of surprise was gone. The Ottomans now knew exactly where the blow was coming, and they had weeks to prepare their defenses under the guidance of capable German officers. The task of taking the peninsula fell to a patchwork force known as the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, including the newly formed Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, famously known as the ANZACs. These were mostly young volunteers, men who had joined the war for adventure and a sense of duty, many of whom had never seen a shot fired in anger. On the morning of April 25, 1915, the invasion began in earnest. The landings were a chaotic mess from the very start. At a place now known as ANZAC Cove, the current swept the landing boats away from their intended flat beaches and toward the base of steep cockhead cliffs. As the sun began to rise, the soldiers looked up in horror at the vertical walls of rock they were expected to climb. They were weighted down by heavy packs, rifles, and ammunition, struggling to find footing in the shifting sand and scrub. From the heights above, Turkish defenders opened fire. It was not a battle so much as a slaughterhouse. The water in the bay turned red as boatload after boatload of men were hit before they even reached the shore. Those who made it to the beach found no cover. They were pinned down against the rocks, digging into the sand with their fingernails while machine gun fire swept across the landing zones. There was no clear communication between the shore and the ships, and the officers on the ground were often killed within minutes of landing, leaving the rank-and-file soldiers to figure out the chaos on their own. Further south at Cape Helles, the situation was even more gruesome. At V Beach, the British used a converted collier ship called the SS River Clyde as a Trojan horse. They planned to run it aground and let thousands of men pour out of sally ports directly onto the shore. It was a massacre. The Turkish defenders had waited until the ship touched the sand before unleashing a torrent of lead. Men were mowed down on the wooden ramps, their bodies piling up so high that those behind them had to climb over a wall of their dead comrades to move forward. The bravery shown by these soldiers was beyond comprehension, but it was bravery wasted on a plan that had no chance of success. The planners had vastly underestimated the resolve of the Ottoman soldier. Under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, who would later become the father of modern Turkey, the defenders were told not just to fight, but to die. To hold the high ground, Kemal famously told his men that he was not ordering them to attack. He was ordering them to die, because in the time it took for them to die, other forces could arrive to take their place. This fanatical defense turned the rugged ridges of Gallipoli into a fortress that the Allies could not break. By the end of the first day, the grand invasion had stalled. Instead of a swift march to Constantinople, the Allied troops were clinging to tiny slivers of beach, barely a few hundred yards deep, with their backs to the sea and the enemy looking down on them from every peak. The logistics of the landing were a nightmare that only grew worse as the hours turned into days. There was no reliable source of fresh water on the peninsula, meaning every drop had to be brought in by ship and carried up the steep cliffs in heavy cans. The heat began to rise, and the smell of death became an ever-present companion. The medical facilities were almost non-existent for a disaster of this scale. Wounded men were left on the beaches for days, waiting for boats to take them back to hospital ships that were already overflowing. There was no room for error. Yet era followed era. The maps used by the British were outdated and inaccurate, showing hills where there were valleys and valleys where there were hills. The soldiers were fighting in a labyrinth of ravines and scrubland, where it was impossible to maintain a straight line of battle. Every time a group of soldiers managed to capture a ridge, they found themselves exposed to fire from a higher ridge they hadn't seen before. The invasion had become a vertical war, fought on the sides of cliffs and in the bottoms of gullies. The hope of a quick victory had vanished by the first sunset, replaced by the grim realization that they were stuck in a hell of their own making. As the first week of the campaign closed, the casualties were already in the thousands. The leadership back in London refused to acknowledge the scale of the failure, instead sending more men and more ships into the fray. They believed that if they just pushed a little harder, the Ottoman line would break. But the line did not break. Dardanelles. Both sides began to dig in, marking the start of a trench warfare system that was even more claustrophobic and terrifying than the one in France. At Gallipoli, the trenches were often only a few yards apart. You could hear the enemy breathing, smell their food, and listen to their conversations. It was an intimate form of slaughter. This first phase of the invasion set the tone for the months to follow. It was a masterpiece of military incompetence, where the courage of the common soldier was the only thing keeping the operation from total collapse. The men on the ground were doing the impossible, but they were doing it for a cause that had been doomed by the very first map drawn in a comfortable office thousands of miles away. This was the beginning of the end for the dream of a quick war in the East, and the start of a long, dark night for everyone involved on the ridges of Gallipoli. As the calendar turned toward the summer of 1915, any hope of a quick breakthrough at Gallipoli had vanished into the dust of the peninsula. The campaign had settled into a horrific stalemate that mirrored the Western Front, but with added layers of environmental misery that few soldiers were prepared for. The geography of Gallipoli made life a constant struggle for survival even when the guns were silent. The trenches were carved into rocky hillsides and narrow ridges, where space was so limited that men lived 8 and slept just inches away from the dead. By June and July, the Mediterranean heat became an enemy as formidable as the Ottoman snipers. The sun beat down on the exposed cliffs, turning the trenches into ovens. Water became the most precious commodity on earth. Each man was often restricted to just 1 pint of water a day for drinking, washing, and shaving, a ration that was barely enough to sustain life in the sweltering heat. This lack of water led to a decline in hygiene that would soon trigger a massive health crisis among the troops. The most pervasive and disgusting feature of the Gallipoli summer was the flies. Millions upon millions of black flies swarmed the peninsula, drawn by the stench of unburied bodies in no man's land and the primitive latrines. These flies were everywhere, covering every inch of a man's food the moment he opened a tin of bully beef. They crawled into the eyes, mouths, and wounds of the soldiers, acting as carriers for disease. Soon, an epidemic of dysentery swept through the ranks of both the Allied and Ottoman armies. Thousands of men who had survived the initial landings were now being evacuated or dying in the trenches from severe dehydration and stomach ailments. The physical exhaustion was total. A soldier in Gallipoli was never truly safe and never truly rested, because the front lines were so close, often separated by only 10 or 15 yards. The threat of a hand grenade or a sudden bayonet charge was constant. The mental strain broke many men, yet the official reports sent back to London continued to paint a picture of steady progress and high morale. In an attempt to break the deadlock, the Allied command planned a massive new offensive for August. This was to be the Great Push, a coordinated series of attacks designed to capture the high ground of the Sari Bear Range and open a new landing at Suvla Bay. The plan was incredibly complex, involving night marches through treacherous ravines and timed bayonet charges against heavily fortified positions. One of the most famous and tragic moments of this offensive occurred at a narrow strip of land known as the Neck. Here, 4 waves of light horsemen from Australia were ordered to charge across a tiny stretch of ground directly into the path of Turkish machine guns. Because of a coordination error, the preliminary artillery bombardment had ended 7 minutes too early, giving the Ottoman defenders plenty of time to return to their positions. Despite seeing the first wave mowed down within seconds, the officers ordered the subsequent waves to continue. It was a suicide mission. Hundreds of young men were slaughtered on a piece of ground no larger than a tennis court, all for a strategic objective that had already been lost. While the British and ANZAC forces suffered, the Ottoman defenders were enduring their own hell on the other side of the wire. They were fighting with their backs to the wall, knowing that if Gallipoli fell, their capital and their empire would be next. The Turkish soldiers, often referred to as Johnny Turk by the ANZACs, earned the deep respect of their enemies. Despite the propaganda that depicted them as barbarians, the men in the trenches found that the Turks were brave, disciplined, and often surprisingly humane. There are many accounts of temporary truces where soldiers from both sides would throw cigarettes or tins of food into each other's trenches. On one occasion, a massive truce was organized to bury the thousands of dead rotting in no man's land. For a few hours, enemies stood side by side, sharing stories and burying their fallen comrades, before returning to their trenches to continue killing each other. This mutual respect grew out of the shared misery of the landscape. Both sides were suffering from the same flies, the same thirst, and the same incompetent decisions made by generals who were miles away from the front lines. The August's offensive ultimately failed to achieve any of its major goals. The new landing at Suvla Bay was a disaster of leadership. Instead of pushing inland immediately, while the hills were lightly defended, the British commander chose to stay on the beach to consolidate his position and distribute water. This delay allowed the Ottomans to rush reinforcements to the heights. By the time the British were ready to move, the window of opportunity had slammed shut. The heights of Chunakbairo were briefly captured by New Zealand troops in a display of incredible grit, but they could not hold the position against a massive counterattack, led by Mustafa Kemal himself. The failure of the August battles marked the psychological end of the campaign for many. It was now clear that the peninsula could not be taken by force. The trenches had become permanent graves for a generation of men. The summer faded into autumn. The heat was replaced by biting winds and the threat of winter, bringing a new set of challenges that would test the endurance of the survivors to the absolute limit. The stalemate at Gallipoli became a political scandal in Britain. Back in London, the government was beginning to realize that the Dardanelles gamble had failed. The press began to leak stories about the horrific conditions and the lack of progress. The man who had championed the invasion, Winston Churchill, was forced out of his high position, his reputation seemingly ruined forever. Yet, despite the obvious failure, the military leadership was terrified of the humiliation that would come with a retreat. They continued to pour resources into a black hole, hoping for a miracle that would never come. The soldiers on the ground felt abandoned. They were fighting a war that the world seemed to have forgotten, trapped on a tiny strip of land where the only thing that grew was the size of the cemeteries. The landscape itself seemed to reject the invaders, with every hill and every gully turned into a fortress. The tragedy of the summer of 1915 was not just the loss of life, but the realization that all that sacrifice had achieved nothing. The lines on the map had barely moved since the first day of the invasion, but the men who had landed in April were now ghosts of their former selves. By the end of this period, the Gallipoli Campaign had become a symbol of everything wrong with the war. It was a theater of missed opportunities and wasted lives. The romantic notions of adventure that had fueled the volunteers in the spring had been replaced by a cynical, hard-edged survivalism. The soldiers had learned that their greatest enemies were not the men in the opposite trench, but the heat, the disease, and the stubbornness of their own commanders. They were stuck in a cycle of violence that had no exit strategy. As the first rains of autumn began to fall, turning the dusty trenches into rivers of mud, the reality of a long winter began to set in. The invasion that should never have happened had now become a permanent scar on the landscape and a haunting memory for the nations that had sent their sons to die for a ridge they could never take. The stage was set for the final act of this tragedy, an act that would require one last miracle to save the survivors from total annihilation. As autumn 1915 bled into winter, the soldiers at Gallipoli faced a new, terrifying enemy. The blistering heat and swarms of flies were gone, replaced by a sudden, violent change in weather the Allied command was utterly unprepared for. In late November, a massive thunderstorm slammed the peninsula. It was followed by 3 days of heavy snow and sub-zero temperatures. The trenches, once dusty ovens, became icy canals. Flash floods ripped through the ravines, drowning men as they slept and washing the bodies of the long dead back into the living quarters. Thousands of soldiers suffered severe frostbite. Many lost fingers and toes. The sight of men being evacuated with frozen limbs was the final straw for the British government. The grim realization hit home. Staying through a full winter would mean the total destruction of their remaining force. The order was finally given to do what many had thought impossible. A full-scale evacuation, right under the nose of a watchful enemy. The evacuation of Gallipoli is ironically remembered as the most successful part of the entire campaign. It was a masterpiece of deception and planning that stood in stark contrast to the bungled landings months earlier. The challenge was immense. Allied troops were so close to the Ottoman lines that any sign of a mass retreat would have invited a devastating attack. So, they got creative. They used a variety of clever tricks to make it seem like the trenches were still full. They rigged rifles with dripping tins of water, so they would fire automatically at irregular intervals, long after the men had left. They kept fires burning and had small groups of men move around in visible areas to maintain the illusion of a full force. One by one, under the cover of darkness, thousands of men were quietly ushered onto boats and taken out to sea. By the time the Ottoman forces realized the trenches across from them were empty, the last of the Allied soldiers were already miles away. Not a single life was lost during the final withdrawal, a miracle of military logistics that historians still study today. But the success of the escape couldn't hide the sheer scale of the failure. When the last ship pulled away from the coast in January 1916, it left behind a landscape littered with the debris of war and the graves of nearly 50,000 Allied soldiers. The Ottoman Empire had also paid a staggering price, losing tens of thousands of its best men to defend its heartland. The campaign had lasted 8 brutal months and achieved absolutely none of its objectives. The Dardanelles remained closed, the Ottoman Empire remained in the war, and Russia remained isolated. The invasion that was supposed to shorten the conflict had only added a massive, tragic chapter to the history books. For the British Empire, it was a moment of deep national shame that led to high-level inquiries and the permanent staining of several military reputations. For the Ottoman Empire, however, it was a moment of supreme national pride. Their victory at Gallipoli became a foundation stone for the modern Republic of Turkey and elevated Mustafa Kemal to the status of a national hero. The legacy of Gallipoli reaches far beyond military statistics. For the young nations of Australia and New Zealand, the campaign was a baptism of fire. Despite the defeat, the courage and endurance shown by the ANZACs on those rugged cliffs became a core part of their national identity. It was at Gallipoli that these soldiers began to see themselves not just as subjects of the British Crown, but as a distinct people with their own unique spirit of mateship and resilience. To this day, the anniversary of the landings, ANZA, is a solemn day of national remembrance, a time to honor the sacrifice of those who fell in a war so far from home. The campaign taught these nations the high cost of blind obedience to distant imperial powers and reshaped their relationship with the world. Gallipoli was a tragedy that forged a sense of brotherhood between the men who fought there, a bond that transcended the lines of battle and exists even today between Turkey and the ANZAC nations. In the years following the war, the battlefields of Gallipoli were transformed into a place of pilgrimage. One of the most moving tributes came from Mustafa Kemal himself. In 1934, he wrote a famous message to the mothers of the fallen Allied soldiers. He told them that their sons were now lying in the soil of a friendly country and were at peace. He said that after losing their lives on this land, they had become Turkey's sons as well. This spirit of reconciliation is perhaps the only positive outcome of such a senseless waste of life. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, there is room for respect and shared humanity. The silent cemeteries that now dot the peninsula stand as a grim warning about the dangers of military hubris and the catastrophic consequences of poor planning. The white headstones looking out over the Aegean Sea tell a story of a generation that was asked to do the impossible and did so without complaint, only to be betrayed by a lack of vision from above. Reflecting on the campaign today, Gallipoli remains the ultimate example of why some invasions should never happen. It was a plan built on the assumption that the enemy would be easily intimidated and that the terrain would be easily conquered. It ignored the reality of the machine gun, the minefield, and the fierce determination of a people defending their own soil. The thousands of men who died in the gullies of ANZAC Cove or on the beaches of Cape Helles were victims of a strategic fantasy that collapsed the moment it met the reality of the Turkish hills. Their bravery was absolute, but it was spent on an objective that was doomed from the start. We tell this story not to glorify war, but to remember the human costs of such massive errors. We remember them so that the mistakes of 1915 are never repeated by those who hold the lives of the next generation in their hands. Gallipoli is now a place of haunting beauty and profound silence. The trenches have been reclaimed by the scrub, and the sound of gunfire has been replaced by the wind blowing off the sea. But the ghosts of the campaign still linger in the collective memory of the world. It stands as a monument to the common soldier, the man who does his duty in the face of certain death, even when he knows the plan is flawed. As we look back on this invasion that should never have happened, we're left with a deep sense of what might have been if better heads had prevailed. The tragedy of Gallipoli isn't just in the lives that were lost, but in the potential that was buried in those trenches. It's a story that continues to resonate because it speaks to the universal themes of sacrifice, failure, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the end, the peninsula belongs to no army, but to the memory of the thousands who remain there, forever young, in the soil they fought so hard to take or to keep. Thanks for watching.